KNIGHT's BAS8. Damage increased by 500%. Skull shattered. Fatal wound inflicted. The chainsword smashed the side of the giant wolf's head, causing it to tumble to the ground. Wolf corpses covered the surrounding area, piling up in mounds. It was truly a blessing that smell didn't exist in the mirror realm. Breathing heavily, Will went to a relatively clean spot and sat on the floor. The fight was a bit more exhausting than he would have liked. Initially, he had thought that going through all 9 waves would have been a breeze. In practice, he had barely completed the 5th, and by the looks of it, there was no chance he'd manage to deal with the next. 4 of his mirror copies had been shattered in the course of the fight. That wasn't good, but even worse, all of them had used up their weapons again. Apparently, items that copies possessed were just as fragile. The chain blades had been useful to kill and injure a few dozen wolves, but there was no way to replace them. How many still alive? Will asked in between breaths. 2, a mirror copy replied a short distance away. Keep them alive. He could use the rest. For close to 20 minutes he sat there, reflecting on what he had gone through. What annoyed him most was that the fight wasn't remotely difficult, just overburdening. Each individual wolf was weak, even the larger ones. Maybe they required a bit of special attention and a dozen more hits, but their actions were painfully slow. Their presence, however, prevented him from dealing with the massive horde of smaller beasts. In a way, the great wolves acted as shields, which was slightly counterintuitive. Once he was back to normal, Will went to see the surviving beasts. One of them had already died. The other lay in a pitiful state, the bones in its legs shattered. Despite it retaining its viciousness, Will felt a certain degree of pity. Given an option, he would have preferred to put it out of its misery, but eternity didn't seem to be built like that. Here, the weak had to take any advantage they could. If keeping the creature longer provided a few extra minutes, Will was going to take them. Dragging his chainsword, Will then went to a nearby giant wolf corpse. Up close, the creature seemed even larger than he initially thought. The fangs and the massive jaws were larger than daggers. Inadvertently, that gave him an idea. Break off the teeth, he told the surviving copies, without getting destroyed. I wouldn't have guessed. One of them gave a snarky reply, then set off to do it. At the same time, Will went up to the giant jaw and kicked a foot out. It was a lot less impressive than he imagined it. The tooth simply dropped out, flying to the ground a few steps away. The important part was that it remained in good enough shape. Will bent down and picked it up. UPGRADA. Large tooth has been transformed into bone sword. Damage capacity X3. Now it really became obvious what an overpowered class the crafter really was. One could only wonder what other skills would appear further on. During the first 3 levels, everyone viewed it as useless, something to be protected for the good of the tutorial. At level 4, everything changed. The crafter could repair weapons, upgrade them, even effectively create them instantly using only available materials. This endless room had nothing in it, nothing except wolf corpses, and yet that proved enough for weapons to be created. Not leaving a single jaw to waste, through multiple combinations, Will created long swords for each of his copies. Anything remaining was upgraded to large throwing knives. The thought of using the teeth of the smaller wolves passed through his mind, but that would have been too finicky. Besides, what he had done so far was disgusting enough. Half an hour later, the last surviving wolf was killed, marking the end of the wave. WVE6. Pack size increased to 8. The next one began without a moment of pause. Without instructions, the mirror copies scattered in various directions. A few moments later, Will also sprinted in the direction of the first dot he saw on the horizon. The total number of monsters was over twice as many as in the previous wave, yet having armed copies made all the difference. Kept in isolation, 15 packs were killed off without significant effort. The problems arose when enough great wolves grouped together, protecting each other from any standard attacks, while packs of smaller wolves lay in wait, eager to counterattack. When it was over, 2 mirror copies had been shattered, reducing the total amount to 17. WVE7. Great wolves per pack increased to 2. With the increased presence of tanky monsters, Will decided on a new approach. Instead of breaking up, he and his copies formed a group, sprinting to kill off packs one by one. Initially, they'd use their range weapons to kill off as many of the small wolves as possible, then focus on the larger beasts. It was quickly discovered that long swords were just as effective at ranged combat as flying knives, with the added bonus that they retained the Knight's Bash bonus. With the fighting over, Will and the mirror copies retrieved their weapons and continued to the next pack, though not before he'd made a few spare broadswords. The pattern repeated almost a dozen more times before the matter of numbers became too much to overcome. Even with speed, strength, and reflexes surpassing each of the wolves, killing hundreds proved impossible. The mirror copies would employ hit-and-run tactics, peeling dozens off the massive pack, while Will used his chain blade to the utmost of his ability. Scores of wolves were torn to pieces or turned into pincushions, and yet they kept on coming like an avalanche. Running out of weapons, the copies resorted to using their fists and legs, yet they were fighting a losing battle. As much as Will didn't want to admit it, he had reached his present limit. Even with all 4 classes, his current number of levels wasn't enough, and nothing short of a heavy machine gun could change that. By the time the last wolf was left, all the mirror copies had been destroyed. Gritting his teeth, Will stood among the mounds of wolf corpses, looking down at the sole survivor. The creature was effectively sliced in two, yet just as violent as it had been at the start. There could be no doubt that it had lost, but in a way, so had Will. In the most optimistic scenario, he'd be facing over 1,000 wolves next time, and would do that alone. In the back of his mind, he could almost hear Daniel tell him that it was a good attempt, but nothing else. Pausing to catch his breath, Will turned around. The exit mirror was barely visible beyond the corpses. Part of him urged him to try one more wave. If he took the time to make enough bone weapons, maybe he'd have a chance to off the next wave from a distance. Even if he were facing 1,000, all he needed was to keep the pack separated. "You win," he said with a sigh, then struck the dying wolf with his chain blade. WAVE8. Great wolves per pack increased to 4. Without delay, Will rushed towards the exit. He didn't even look at the horizon to check the density of the appearing dots. Grabbing his backpack on the way, he leaped into the mirror, which instantly brought him back to the classroom. CHALLANGEOVER. Waves past 7. CHALLANGEREWARD set. 1. BRONZEWOLFKE. YFRAGMENT permanent. Enter the WOLFCHALLLNGE from your mirror fragment. Unavailable during tutorial. 2. WOLFMIRRORIE. YF permanent wolf mirrors are marked on your mirror fragment even if unvisited. This was the first time 2 rewards had simultaneously been presented. Despite that, he was far from pleased. In the future, if he managed to get all 4 classes again, he'd have to come a lot more prepared, both in terms of skills and ammunition. Having a few hundred copies would definitely have helped, possibly won him the challenge. The chain blade felt heavy in his hands. Using the disassemble skill on it, Will quickly separated it into its main components. As fancy as the weapon was, it required the knight's strength to be useful, which he wouldn't have in the foreseeable future. Making his way to the nearest upright desk, Will sat down. He knew from experience that his body was functioning purely on adrenaline. Once the high subsided, he'd feel exhausted as if he'd been run over by the football team. Will relaxed, lying down on the desk, then took out his mirror fragment. He could see a multitude of green heads throughout his eternity zone. Some of them he was familiar with, others not so much. The good news was that there was a substantial amount, guaranteed that he could raise several classes nearly to their maximum. After the tutorial was over, that was definitely something worth doing. "I challenge you, Danny," he said, looking into the mirror. As usual, his reflection changed. 4 classes? Daniel smirked. Must have been difficult to pull that off. Why can't I defeat the wolf challenge? Will was too tired to beat about the bush. So you're doing challenges now? The way he said it suggested it was way too early. Finish the tutorial before you jump into the ocean. Why? You told me you never completed the tutorial. I gathered over 50 permanent skills before my accident. Daniel all but laughed. What do you have? 1 and 2 halves? You haven't even permanently increased your wound limit. Do you think you can complete a challenge? As much as Will wanted to argue, there was no denying the facts. I came close, he reluctantly admitted. 7 waves. 7 of 9? It was impossible to tell whether Daniel was impressed or amused. It's the final one that counts. Oh, and just so you know, relying on classes is a bad idea. The hint said. Experiment with other classes? Daniel interrupted. Explore new combinations? The hints say a lot of things, half of which contradict the other half. The only things you can rely on are permanent skills and everything that's in your inventory. Everything else is random and up for grabs. That felt like an utter lie. Everyone in Will's group had gladly granted him their skills when he had asked. Well, with the exception of Helen, the last few loops. She had done so before, though. Did you complete the challenge? Will asked. No, Daniel admitted. I was focusing on getting out of eternity. He paused. I know you've been thinking about it. It's the class that asks the questions. And the other classes don't? Each class comes with its nature. The knight always wants to protect, spending eternity in search of a king. The thief wants to have a fun time, taking what he likes even when he doesn't need it. The crafter wants to focus on what makes things tick, then improving it. You think those are your ideas? They belong to the class, and the longer you take it, the stronger they grow until you can't turn them off anymore. Chills ran down Will's spine. The description reminded him of an orgasm he'd been taught about in biology class, a parasite. Being concepts, they couldn't exist in a body of their own, so they were slowly transforming the person using them into a living personification. Is that what happened to the previous participants? Will pressed on. They turned into the mirror images we fought during the tutorial? Fuck if I know. I never went through the tutorial, remember? Are you turning into them? It was just a guess on Will's part, but it made a lot more sense than everything else he'd thought of so far. The real Daniel had died a week before the start of eternity. The person who was in the mirror fragment was nothing but an image locked in eternity. He had already shown that he could control some mirrors and challenges at the school. What if, after a certain amount of time, he transformed into a dark version of his class? That would be one explanation for him rushing Will so much. Get Helen to finish the tutorial in the next few loops, Danny urged. That way, it'll be better for everyone. Tell me why. Only when you've earned it. Danny's reflection vanished from the fragment.